Welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be breaking down my top 5 summertime walleye lures. These are the baits that I'm using in the months of July and August and also into early September, and then on the front side of the season maybe late June as well, depending on what the weather has brought in that particular year. But I'm going to run through these baits one by one. These are the baits that I am relying on right now, and first and foremost we're going to start out with the classic live bait rig, Lindy rig, whatever you want to call it. I actually just got done doing a video on this particular presentation where I really went in depth both on not only the componentry but also the strategies behind this particular rig. On the business end, it starts off right here with just a simple number 2 octopus style hook. On this particular rod I've got about a 9-foot fluorocarbon leader, and I have the fluorocarbon connected to a snap and a swivel, which is connected to the braided main line. Right up from there I have a bead and then just a standard 1/2 ounce bullet sinker. So essentially what I'm doing with this particular presentation more often than not is I'm going to be marking fish out in deep water, and I'm going to drop this rig straight down below the boat, and I'm going to hold it off to the side of the boat, and I'm going to wait till I feel a thump. So basically what I want to be doing is I want to have this sinker just, right around a foot off the bottom. Every once in a while I'll point my rod tip down and tap the weight against the bottom just to make sure that I'm staying close to the bottom, close to the strike zone. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm just moseying around on small pieces of structure, looking for fish and waiting for that thump on the end of my line. And when I feel it, I let the line out and I let the fish eat it for a few seconds, and then I slowly reel up and set the hook. It's a really simple tactic and it catches them all summer long. I mean, essentially all you're doing is taking live bait, putting it on a little hook, and then you have a bunch of invisible fluorocarbon and you're just dangling that bait right in front of the walleye's face. So in particular, the spots that I like to use it on are typically not super big spots that have a lot of area to cover where the fish might be scattered all over. For situations like that, I have a few other presentations that I tend to prefer, but I like to use this in areas that are fairly small because I don't like to move more than about a 1/2 mile an hour when I'm pulling a Lindy rig. So that's number 1, the Lindy rig. Now it's time for number 2, which is just a classic spinner rig. Now what's great about the spinner rig is the fact that you really can cover a ton of water with it. So I'm going to run through the componentry really quick. I like to run my spinner rigs most of the time on a bait casting rod. I like braided line as well. Mono works good too. And from there I have this little black piece of plastic right here, which basically allows me to quickly and easily change out slick sticks. Now I like slick sticks because, like I mentioned, they're easy to change out if you happen to be changing depths a lot. It's nice to have something that you can clip on and off super easy. That's why I like this. I also like your traditional bottom bouncer, and another way that I also like to present spinners is just to use just a straight bullet sinker like I showed you on the Lindy rig before. What I'll use that particular setup for is when I'm going through somewhat shallow weeds where you have the bullet sinker to cut right through the weeds and with the spinner spinning behind it. So that's another system that I like. But right here I got the slick stick on there, and connected to the braid I actually have a snap. So what's great about the snap is I can easily pop it off and change out spinner rigs that I have pre-tied. Now the spinners that I do have ready to go will have a swivel on them, so the line twist is taken care of right there. Now from there I'll usually have a 4 or 5 foot leader down to the business end. This one right here is actually a polycarbonate blade, and what I like about polycarbonate blades is the fact that you can run them a lot slower if you want to. So I would say traditionally I'll be running my bottom bouncers anywhere from 1 to 1.5 miles an hour, but these little guys right here will actually run down to like, I'd say roughly 0.3 miles an hour. This one right here has got 2 hooks on it. It's a crawler rig, and you can do single hook setups. There's a lot of different things that you can do with spinner rigs, not only with the type of blade, but colors and bead colors, and there's a lot of different variables to play with. So spinner rigs are really awesome when you happen to be fishing large areas where the fish are scattered all about. Whenever we go up to Lake of the Woods, we might be fishing just a giant basin area where the fish are just scattered all over the place. that's where spinner rigs really shine, because if you have a lot of water to cover, rigging is going to be way too slow in those situations. And with blades, like I said, you can go 1 mile an hour, 1.5, you could even go 2 miles an hour if you wanted to, and you can cruise those baits. Personally, my favorite thing to put behind a spinner rig is a crawler, but you can also do leeches and minnows and even plastics if you want. That's number 2, the spinner rig, really great for covering water. And number 3 is a bait that's not quite as good at covering water. It's kind of actually super terrible at that, and that is the bobber rig. Now, where the bobber rig really shines is when you know exactly where the fish are, and maybe there's a few of them potted up, you know, up on a rock pile, or maybe right on an inside quarter of the tip of a point, or on an edge where you just happen to know there's a bunch of fish. You marked them on your electronics. What I like to do is I like to dangle a leech right in front of the fish's face there, or a minnow or a crawler. You can do a lot of different things on any of these live bait setups. Now, if I'm targeting walleyes in shallower waters with my bobber, then typically what I'll do is I'll cast it up to them. But when I'm in deep water, one tactic that I like to do is a tactic that's commonly known as power corking. And essentially what you do is you just drive around till you see a big pod of walleyes underneath your boat, and then I'll just take my bobber and I'll toss it out behind the boat right around where I think those walleyes are. And then one of the biggest parts about power corking is making sure that you have plenty of weight right here above the swivel. That bait gets down in a hurry, and then you let that bobber and that leech soak in their face for, you know, 30 seconds, whatever you deem the appropriate time. And if they don't bite, then you move along and look for another pod of fish. That's actually one way that you can cover a lot of water with this particular presentation, but otherwise, for the most part, fishing a bobber is going to be a really slow, methodical way to fish. This really isn't a presentation that you can move. I'm not going to be trolling with a bobber because that leech is just going to fly up in the air way out of the walleye strike zone as soon as I start moving. So this is really a solitary presentation, but sometimes this can be the absolute most tempting thing you can possibly show a walleye. Of course, I have the number 2 Octopus Hook, which just tends to be my all-around walleye hook. And then from there, I actually have 6-pound fluorocarbon. I have a fairly long leader, not quite the whole length of the rod, roughly like 5.5, 6 feet. And then about halfway down, I just have a little split shot. And what that does is just makes it so the hook gets down a little bit faster, in addition to the bullet sinker that I have just above the swivel. So I have a swivel connecting the fluorocarbon leader to the braided line, and then I have a bead, and then I have that bullet sinker. And what the bullet sinker does, as I explained earlier, is it gets the whole package down a lot faster, so it just helps you be more efficient. This is one of Northland's new Lite bite bobbers, made of balsa. It has a weight on the bottom. It's a weighted bobber, which just helps it sit up a little bit better. And then above that, I have a bobber stop. Now on the rod reel line side of things, there's a lot of opinions, but one hard and fast rule that I have is that I like to use as long of a rod as humanly possible that I can get my hands on. Now 8 foot, 8.5 foot is optimal. Honestly, anything over 7 foot is probably fine, but the longer the better. And the reason for that is when you're bobber fishing, your main line is going straight out to the bobber, and then it's going straight down to your hook. And why that's an issue is there's a lot of slack in your line before that thing straightens out. So when the bobber goes down, you need to reel down and tighten it as much as you can, and then slowly sweep up. And the longer that your rod is, the better hook set you're gonna get into that fish. So that is one of the biggest issues with bobber fishing, especially when you're fishing a bobber that's out away from the boat. So that's just something to think about. And for that exact same reason, I like to run braided line, but I will also recognize the fact that your bobber stop likes to slide up and down that line. It doesn't stick quite as good as it does on mono. So that's just something that I deal with. But for me, it's worth it because it helps me put a better hook in the fish. And I'm not gonna lie, I do go back and forth between braid and mono, but right now I'm kind of on a braid kick. So anywho, that's just a simple, quick rundown. Obviously, you know, some of these tactics I could go a lot more in depth on, and I will definitely do that in a future video. and I'll talk about all the different componentry and all the different strategies for using these particular presentations. But for now, I'm gonna keep it somewhat brief and we're gonna move on to the next tactic. Number 4 on the list is the horizontal minnow bait. And that includes the puppet minnow, jig and wrap, shiver minnow, all those different baits that have a nice, heavy, hard body, and then the V-shaped tail in the back. And this is a really killer midsummer walleye bait, and the reason for that is sometimes you flash this thing right in front of the walleye's face and they don't even know it hit them and they just have to strike it. There's a lot of different situations where this bait shines, and the reason why I love it is because it gets down to the fish in a hurry. It's got a really thin profile, it's real heavy, and when you drop it in the water, it gets down to the bottom in just a couple seconds. So where that's really useful is when I'm driving around either on my trolling motor or with my big motor and I mark a school of fish just underneath the boat. I can toss this thing back behind the boat and know that it's gonna be down there in just a couple seconds. When it hits bottom, give it a couple rips, and oftentimes the fish are gonna snap it. Now I'm gonna run through the componentry really quick. So for a rod, I like to use about a 7-foot medium power fast action rod, and personally I like to use braided line. Now there is a good argument for using monofilament line because oftentimes you will land more fish when you're using mono, but there's a lot of benefits to using braid as well. No matter what you do, make sure you have a swivel right underneath your braided line, because there's gonna be a ton of line twist when you're using this particular bait, because when you're ripping it, it jumps this way, then that way, then that way. And if you don't have a swivel, you're gonna get a crazy amount of line twist. And from there, I have just like a fairly short fluorocarbon leader for just a little bit of extra stretch, and the fact that you have some invisibility as well when you're fishing in clear water. But all in all, one thing I would caution you is to make sure you're bulking up your presentation a little bit, at least on the line side of things when you're using this particular bait. Like usually I will use 8-pound or even 6-pound fluorocarbon for a lot of my leaders, but when I'm using the jig and wrap, puppet minnow, shiver minnow, etc., I like to use 10-pound because typically I'm ripping that bait hard. This is a big heavy bait, and when a fish bites it, they usually smash it. So I'm setting the hook hard, the fish is hitting the bait hard. Ultimately, you're just gonna want to have a little bit more of a beefier setup when you're using this particular bait. So that's a quick rundown on number 4. Like I said, I'm gonna go a little bit more in depth on some of these presentations in future videos, but for now, a little brief explanation before we jump into number 5, my final summertime walleye bait, and that is just your classic jig and plastic. Now where the jig and plastic really shines is when you're fishing in places where you probably don't want to be using that horizontal minnow bait that we just talked about, with the treble underneath and the hook sticking out in every which way. Those baits are really prone to snagging up, whereas the classic jig and plastic setup barely ever gets snagged up in anything. And the reason for that is the fact that it has one small hook coming off of the top of the bait, and it's sort of protected by the plastic as it's coming over rocks and weeds and all those things. So this is a great bait when you're fishing up in the cover. I like to use it in shallow water. I've caught walleyes as shallow as like 3 feet of water on actually 3-foot rocks. But I will fish this bait anywhere from that depth out to like 12 to 15 feet. Anything deeper than that, it sort of loses its effectiveness, just the way that you're ripping the bait. So when most people think of jigs, they're thinking dragging or maybe just popping. But with this bait, you're literally ripping it, especially during the summertime months when the walleye's metabolism is at its peak. You're gonna be ripping this bait through the dining hall and they're gonna smash it. So what I do is I'll cast it out as far as I can, and then the way that I'm working this bait is I'm letting it fall down to the bottom first and foremost, and then I give it a rip, reel, rip, reel, rip, reel. With this particular bait, it runs through the weeds, it goes over tops of the rocks, rarely snags up, and it's just another way to get a reaction strike from walleyes that happen to be in a little bit of a different habitat. Now I happen to be using the deep V jig which has the skinny head, it's got big eyes, but most importantly, it has a long shank hook, which is extremely important when you're using plastics. And behind it, I just have like a smelt minnow, which is just kind of your classic straight tail plastic. Some days the walleyes are gonna want something that's falling a little bit slower. In that case, you might wanna switch to a paddle tail plastic or downsize your jig head. But ultimately, for me, I like to fish this bait pretty darn quickly. You don't always catch a ton of fish when you're fishing with a jig and plastic up in the shallows, but more often than not, you're gonna catch some of the biggest walleyes in the lake. So that's a reason why I always have this particular presentation tied up and ready to go. Now on the rod reel line side of things, I like to use a 7-foot medium power extra fast action. That tends to work perfectly when I'm rip jigging the plastic through the weeds, and then when I hook up with the fish, I have enough power to pull them out of the weeds so they don't get me all tangled up in the thick stuff. And I also, for that exact same reason, like to use braided line, because that allows me to have instant contact with the fish. I can pull them out of the weeds right away, and it also works great for when the bait happens to get fouled up in the weeds or caught in it for a second. The no stretch capability of braid allows me to just quickly and easily rip that bait out of the weeds. And oftentimes when you're hung up and you pop that bait out, that's when the walleye likes to strike it. So that's a couple important characteristics when you're using a jig and plastic. Also, I will mention that I like to add a little fluorocarbon leader to the end here as well. And the reason why is more often than not, I'm fishing up shallow where there's plenty of light, and when I'm fishing clear bodies of water, it pays to have fluorocarbon. I like to use 8-pound test tied directly to the jig. So that's kind of my setup for the jig and plastic. Like I said, this bait catches some of the biggest walleyes in the lake, so I always have it tied up. So there you have it, my top 5 summertime walleye lures from top to bottom. Hopefully you learned something in this video. Hopefully you add one of them to your personal summertime arsenal. I know that I've had a ton of success on all 5 of those presentations. I'll leave some links down below in the description of this video in case you're looking for any specific componentry that I might be using on any of these rigs. I'll try and break it down as good as I can down in the description, and I would also love it if you guys left a comment. What is your #1 summertime walleye tactic? Let me know in the comments. If you're hungry for some more good walleye fishing information, make sure to check out this video right here. That's my complete guide to Lindy rigging, live bait rigging, whatever you want to call it. If you remember earlier in this video, that was the first tactic that I mentioned. And in this video right here, I go in depth and I break down everything you need to know. So check it out. Thank you for watching.